Yeah, so before we start, a few ground rules. Firstly, do not exceed your time limit. Anything you say beyond 7 minutes 15 seconds for constructive speeches and 4 minutes 15 seconds for reply speeches will not go down on our sheets. I will indicate in the chat once your time is up, and you should also keep time for yourselves. Secondly, please ask and take POIs. One POI per speech is encouraged, and the more POIs you take, the better. Having said that, Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Hello. Before I begin my speech, I'd just like to give a quick shout out. So I know that my students, my kids essentially from St. Nicholas, like to watch these recordings. I'd like to give them a quick shout out. To anyone who can actually see this recording will receive the shout out. I'm not going to talk about it otherwise. Y'all encourage me to do better essentially and to try and be a good example of debating. Anyway, and yeah, a large part of it, of why I try to do better is so that I don't look like a hypocrite in front of y'all. Anyway, right, I'll start my speech soon. PY's in the chat. Imagine a world where individuals could make arbitrary medical decisions for each other. It is on no other basis than the relation of blood. The reality is that parents have no more authority to make medical decisions for me as I do for Cavan and Naomi. And that is the claim government bench will make. And we will explain to you why just because it is your child, you do not have the right to kill them. Before I get to my argumentation, a couple of points of setup on how our world look like. We will obviously have extensive consultations between medical professionals, parents, and children. We know that this is likely symmetric, but this helps our side given that it allows these medical professions to understand and access parent sides of the story, children's situations, etc., and that will be taken into account. Secondly, if doctors genuinely make the call that life-saving medical treatment is absolutely necessary, then children have to undergo it. Maybe it's the case we have to educate them from their parents in the meantime in order to undergo it. For example, we wheel them into the room, give them the blood transfusion, and wheel them out having received the blood. That's entirely possible. 3, if we have reason to believe that parents will continue to pose an active threat to this child, abuse them, etc., we would likely do the same thing we would do in other situations where parents are abusive towards children and extricate their children from the parents permanently. These are entirely possible policy options we can bake in to avoid possible harms. Well, the first thing I want to establish then in my speech is how doctors will decide. And the framing from government bench is that doctors will tend to go towards the most clean-cut cases for patients for 3 reasons. The first is that doctors recognize generally that they're providing medical recommendations. They know that they've gone through 7 years of this understanding how the human body works and 0 years of philosophy education. So the ability to actually claim, for example, one thing is more moral than the other probably does on some level do their awareness lie outside the scope of doctors' awareness. This means that by and large, doctors will default away from making rash decisions and default to parents and children most of the time. Secondly, doctors likely see the children as clients and therefore want them to make medical decisions themselves. Thirdly, doctors want to avoid being held accountable for controversial claims. Claims like decisions that make the child suffer, for example, or cause undue harm to the likely will be harms that doctors are held accountable for if they are the one to make the decision. But if they defer to the parents for the most part, they can avoid that accountability. Now, note, this does shrink our impacts in terms of not letting doctors take every decision, but it shrinks it to very specific cases of clear-cut cases where parents will harm the child, like irrevocably, unless doctors intervene. What are these cases then? I will debate on all cases, however, just to make sure that I'm debating well and my kids learn that well. Firstly, then, on what kinds of cases that are probably involved. We think that the vast majority of cases will be religious. And the actual explanation for this is particular religions opt into particular beliefs that avoid beneficial stuff. The prominent example being Jehovah's Witnesses, who refuse blood transfusions even if it saves people's lives. And the example, and this is likely the most common instance because most kids are healthy, like the children are actually a remarkably resilient bunch, and modern medical science has actually allowed children remarkable ability to recover from most things, unless they're hit by a car. In that scenario, they need blood. And in that scenario, it is usually the Jehovah's Witnesses saying, don't give them blood, let the child die, because that's our religious doctrine. Why then should religious rights not extend to killing your child? Because the child themselves are a distinct entity from the parent. They did not consent into being born into a religious household. that then means that we have limitations in terms of what the parents can decide on behalf of the child for. Even if the child is indoctrinated into that religion and appears to consent, in those instances, that consent is often illegitimate because it's obviously indoctrination. Children have lived in the echo chambers of their parents for the most part. They internalize all of the values that parents teach them. They're not individuals yet. There's parallel here being they cannot get married, for example. All of these then mean that doctors have to be the ones making these clean-cut decisions. But so the second justification is the state also has an obligation to the person you will become later on, and you cannot have any other freedoms if you're dead, and you will not become a person later on if you're dead. I'll take the point.
So the reason why the extensive discussion on your side doesn't work is because in these scenarios we're talking about, usually it's life or death, but very urgent. So like if you're hit by a car, you don't fucking have 4 weeks to talk about this shit. You have like 2 hours. That is why you cannot get that. And that's why doctors don't make really nuanced decisions.
That's entirely possible, but if you're talking about like a car accident, for example, they will probably have heuristics. Like we'll go like, what happens if a patient is wheeled in with like a blood transfusion thing, and the mom screams, "Jehovah's Witness," and then the doctor goes, "Okay, we have a procedure for this," and they'll default to the procedure. That's how doctors get things done very quickly, usually. Anyway, once the counterfactual on our side, we recognize that this will probably make religions slightly upset, but note that most religions will likely adapt. They can reinterpret doctrine. They can claim that the doctrine was outdated, for example, or misinterpreted. All of these are entirely possible. Religions are likely to do this rather than other things because very few religions can continue to coexist in mass tension with the laws of the state. Followers tend to have dual loyalties to the state, meaning that they tend to see themselves as law-abiding citizens first, who are not criminals or murderers, etc., and religious individuals second. This means that religions have an incentive to capitulate the desires of the state, not do anything horribly controversial, etc. They will default to these, adjust to the new reality, essentially. This then means that on our side of the house, we protect children from the horrible doctrines that cost them their lives. Opposition has to defend subjecting children to the arbitrary whims of their parents based on arbitrary doctrinal teachings. But I'm going to go even further. There are other possible scenarios we recognize aside from religion that might cause children to have to like go through this. One of which being medical debt, right? It's entirely possible that kids like parents cannot afford to take care of the kids. We think that these are overwhelmingly a small scenario, like small number of cases, for the very simple reason that there's an extreme social stigma around preserving money over your children. Like one is seen as morally virtuous to take care of the child, one is seen as morally nefarious, hoarding money. And therefore, most parents will not make this decision. But even in those scenarios, we think that number one, you have no ability to kill your children. That's because you cannot afford them, because you consent into the possibility of having an expensive child, the point at which you choose to have a child. This is the intuition pump here is that children with Down syndrome and extreme autism can be extremely costly to care for. You have to care for lots of nurses and medical professionals, etc. But you can't kill them just because you can't care for them. But secondly, even if there's little subsidies for these individuals now, over time, states will likely economically grow as capitalism proceeds, and that will allow future subsidies to help these people out, but you can't do that if the child is dead. The last scenario I'm going to talk about is suffering and a child possibly suffering. I've already explained in my framing why this is unlikely to be the case. That doctors, if children are suffering, will likely default to the choice of children because they see them as clients, they want to avoid controversial decisions, etc. But even in scenarios where doctors make the other decision and cause a child to live, we think that's fine because children should not be allowed to consent to kill themselves. And the very simple reason for this is that death is so irreversible and so unknown. And children, uniquely, do not know what it is like to be alive. They do not have the experience of what it's like to literally live because they haven't been around for that long. In the exact same way that and they don't have the mental maturity as well. In the same way that we don't allow them to vote, get married, have sex, etc., we don't allow them to die. On our side of the house, we prevent these irreversible decisions by parents based on arbitrary religious doctrine. And in our worst case scenario, even if it's about suffering children, we stop them from making them take on the worst possible moral harm of death. So proud to propose.
Thanks for that speech, Leader of Op. Before Leader of Op, OC, can you stop recording?
DPM. Perfect. Yeah, DPM whenever.
Okay. I'm gonna shout out someone. I'm gonna shout out some people. I would like to shout out my Singapore Polytechnic students who are watching now. Now, I would like my POIs in chat, please. Thank you. I will first discuss whether doctors have good incentives. In many cases, it's not one singular doctor deciding the treatment, but rather a group of experts that are conferring with one another and deciding which is the most appropriate treatment. Secondly, doctors go through years of medical training to know the optimal procedure to recommend, and they also, as part of their training, go through empathy training to understand the mindset of victims who are sick and ill. Thirdly, doctors do not want to risk their license for a wrong recommendation and permanently lose their job, so they won't recommend an experimental treatment with a low likelihood of success and a high chance of pain, because this will compromise their ability to practice in the future. This is a more proximate interest than their monetary incentive of getting a short-term pay from recommending an experimental treatment. They are more likely going to prioritize being able to stay in the industry for a long period of time and continue earning money. Fourthly, many of the cases we are referring to are rather open and shut cases. Given this specific condition, given this specific injury, we already have a lot of medical history about this patient. We already understand this condition relatively well. In many of those instances, it's rather open and shut, and therefore it's quite clear-cut what procedure should be recommended. And there has been a lot of studies and a lot of research about why this particular procedure would save the person's life and is a high likelihood of working. And the last thing to say is that doctors are subject to strict regulation and guidelines, both from the government, but also from the internal board of medicine, that controls their behavior and prevents them from making unilateral decisions that might harm the patient. These are all the reasons to suggest that the characterization of doctors on their side of the house is unrealistic. On weighing, there is less standardization of the interests and mindsets of parents. All doctors think and act in rather similar manners because they are all trained in similar medical schools and they're all subject to guidelines and regulations from the Board of Medicine. In comparisons, parents range and differ much more differently, from poor parents to religious parents to parents that might care about themselves more than they care about their children. I know we like to believe the characterization that parents always love their children and have the best interest of their child at their heart. And I'm sure that's true for many parents, but this is not true of all parents. There's less standardization, there's a greater diversity of parents, and therefore there are some parents that love their religion more. And this means there is no accountability. If a doctor recommends a wrong treatment that ends up killing the child or ends up hurting the child significantly, this means that the doctor can be brought to court for malpractice. We can suspend their license. But if a parent selfishly decides that they want to not let the child live anymore because it's too inconvenient, because it goes against their religious beliefs, because they selfishly decide that they just want to prioritize their own life anymore, is this a minority of parents? Yes, but such parents do exist. And even one child dying because of that is an immense tragedy that we should never allow. What is the accountability on their side of the house? If a parent has an invalid decision to not allow this procedure to go on, what will they do to the parent? There is no mechanism on their side of the house. I will now discuss whether the right for parents exists. The first observation is that parental control is not absolute. We allow parents to decide certain things, for example, what religion the child subscribes to, what school they attend, or what time they come home. But these are areas of decision-making where the choices parents make are reversible, have lower impact, or are subjective in nature. When a parent chooses things that are objectively harmful, choosing to starve a child, choosing to beat a child, we take the child away from them. Therefore, the rights of parents extends insofar as there is no objective harm being done to a child. Death is an absolute and irreversible harm that we explain. Death is the absolute robbing of agency and depriving of any future experiences or happiness. All other future rights flow from the right of life. Therefore, it is the most categorical objective harm that parents do not have the right to say that the child ought to die. The parent and child are distinct and separate entities. For the most existential decision, whether you can continue embracing future experiences and grow older and see the kind of adult that you become, we don't think that parents have the right to choose death for the child. I will now explain why this choice is fundamentally immoral. The first observation to make is that this is akin to murder. If I walk into the toilet and I see my little brother drowning in a bathtub and I just watch him slowly die, I would receive criminal punishment because I had the capacity to save him, but I did not act on it. The moral principles apply to this debate as well. A doctor has the capacity to save a child, but the parent is just forcing the doctor to watch as the child dies, even though the doctor has the capacity to save a child. This is an instance where the parent is allowing the child to die. The second reason why this is immoral is because of what Ian explains. Ian explains the scenarios for why the parent might allow the child to die. Things like medical debt, things like not wanting to take care of the child, things like having certain religious beliefs. In every one of these instances, the parent is prioritizing their own interests, their own beliefs, and their own convenience over a child's life. And this responds to their claim about how religious communities will ostracize the child, because clearly the religious communities will end up blaming the doctor and blame the medical institution, but on their side of the house, parents feel the pressure to let the child die, because it's on their side of the house that the parents are blamed for allowing their blood transfusion, where the parents feel the guilt of going back to church. On our side of the house, the parents can deflect the blame to the medical institution, and therefore parents on outside of the house who actually want their child to live are benefited on our side. If I stormed into an operating theater and stopped the surgery midway because it goes against my religious beliefs, you will all call me a lunatic and lock me up. But somehow, just because this person has a biological relation to the child, we allow them to do that. The parent-child relationship is arbitrary. The child never chose this set of parents. They never chose to be born. And yet, due to this arbitrary relation, we are letting this parent terminate the child's life just because of a resemblance in DNA. I have now explained why the right does not exist. I've explained why the right is immoral. And I will now explain the inverse for why parents have a duty and obligation to keep the child alive. Before that, POI.
So let's play a fun thought experiment just for the sake of this debate. Let's assume that in order to agree, or in order for the child to stay alive, it comes at the cost of the parent dying. In those instances, is the parent still legitimate in letting the child die?
That is clearly not the instance that we're describing here. Please, the central focus of this debate, as already explained in Ian, refers to specific cases where the life-saving treatment has a high probability of improving the child's life, where there's no cost to the parent, and also it's not some experimental treatment where the child will undergo like some heavy mutation and then the child will come out as like a completely different person. We're talking about cases where there's clear outcomes where the child's life will be safe. Now, why does the parent have a duty to keep the child alive? This is part of parental obligation. We generally believe parents have the right to protect their child and to keep them safe. A parent who forgets their child in a car on a hot afternoon is liable for parental neglect. But secondly, parents choose to have a child, which means they consented to the process of taking care of a child. This is why we do not let parents kill their children who are born with mental or physical disabilities, even though they are difficult to take care of, and even though they are exhausting to take care of. Notice, this extends to medical debt as well. In the same way we expect parents to work and provide food for children, they should pay for their hospital fees. The more direct point to make here is that it is rather dystopic that for millions of parents around the world who cannot afford hospital bills, they are forced to now say that they might have to terminate the life-saving treatment for their child because they cannot afford it anymore. This is a result of state failure that should not be paid for with the lives of children. But more crucially, children are a sympathetic group of people, meaning they'll always be viewed as innocent and there's always political will to subsidize the treatments for them, which means that medical debt is alleviated on outside of the house where life-saving treatment is forced to be given out to children, and because the expenditure is forced, there is an incentive for the electorate to make that expenditure much lesser, as opposed to on their side, where saving a child is optional, and therefore there's lower political will to actually subsidize this treatment. But lastly, and the most trivial mitigation that we have here, is that many of these treatments are rather affordable in nature, and therefore that consideration of medical debt doesn't necessarily incur.
Thanks for that speech, dear Lo.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Cool. For POIs, if you can just turn on your camera and wave. So like, I know y'all are together, so like, y'all can just like squat up. Then I'll take a POI. Because there's too many people, so it's hard to look at the chat. Cool. There are more ways to die than when your heart stops beating. Because for a child, if their dream was to live and walk and be happy, and their lifelong surgery prevents them from doing so, we thought it was reasonable that that child decided, on behalf of using the right of the parent and discussing with the parent, to take away their own lives if that was the only way in which they're able to conceptualize utility. And that was why we thought it was important and incredibly powerful that parents had this decision. I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, let me just explain the stuff on incentives and explain why we are ahead there. The first thing I want to deal with is the last 15 seconds of Cavan's speech, which explains why political capital goes away. That's fucking bullshit because Ian frames that this debate happens in the minority of cases, but this is also true for the intuitive reason that things, for example, like the glorification of family, things, for example, like the importance placed on love, but also things, for example, like the backlash that PM themselves talk about, explain why in the vast majority of instances, how to live, and therefore be in agreement with doctor. If that is true, there cannot be meaningful political capital shifts as a result of that. The second thing I want to frame out is the stuff on parents, because let's be real, if it is massive amounts of neglect, there are likely other mechanisms that existed prior to this hospital visit that allow for these parents to be fucking removed from the life of the child. Because if you're an abusive parent, there are likely telltale signs of it when your child goes to school, for example. If it is the case that you're an asshole, for instance, things like community watch or things, for example, like the rise of political capital to deal with things like this exist because of the rise of liberalization as such. So the type of parents we're talking about in this debate cannot be meaningfully super abusive ones. These are likely parents that already don't have access to the legal ability to have ownership over the child. These are cases in which the parents probably do mean well, before, as PM identified, religious or personal reasons are unable to let that child live. That is where our harms kick in. That was the harm that Cavan did not respond to, because a lot of this stuff actually doesn't respond to the ramifications that we explained in first op. The final thing I want to then explain is the stuff on doctors. So to be clear, I'm going to concede everything Prop says, because Valley's analysis on doctors is actually not mutually exclusive with what Prop explains. We agree that doctors obviously have good incentives to do well and not to get a lawsuit, but our argument was that the analysis PM provides and DPM explains why it is the case that doctors in the vast majority of instances are going to default towards using medical treatment. Yes, medical treatment that is safe, but still a medical treatment. And I want to explain why this is particularly harmful. The first reason is because I don't think it's sufficient for DPM to say, well, no, but the issue is they're like fairly safe. Because obviously all medical treatment requires a degree of trade-off and a harm to be inflicted on the individual. The problem is often, for example, the child feels massive amounts of pain and do not want to do it. For instance, if I know that I really like my hair and the only way for me to stay alive is to lose my hair and I'd rather die, and my parents agree with that, why is that not legitimate for me to decide? Because on proposition, the doctor can say, no, we want you to stay alive because otherwise I might get sued. Otherwise there might be massive harm to me. In those instances, we think you're not only violating the consent of the child, but also the consent of the parent, and it is unclear, no thank you, Ian, why the doctor necessarily have the capacity to make those decisions. But this is also important for the reason we explained, which is, yes, doctors are good, but they prioritize medical treatment both for practical career reasons, but also because it shields against lawsuits. Because if you try to do something that is somewhat safe and it fails, or you try to do something and later the parents complain, you're able to say, at least I try to make them stay alive. That is why in almost all instances, doctors will default towards trying to keep the child alive, and that is where the clash comes in. Because sometimes the child and the parent collectively do not want to keep the child alive, and we think in those instances alone, we win the debate, because we better honor the agency that PM says was particularly important. The response they give in PM is to say, no, but you can have consultations. First response, like obviously this is symmetric, and if it is the case that consultations are so powerful, they're able to change the opinion of like parents, and that is fine. So this debate obviously exists in instances in which the parent cannot be convinced. But second of all, in a lot of instances, you can't, because if it is life and death and very urgent, like who the fuck are you going to talk to? The child can't speak because they fucking got hit by a car, and the parent is probably very panicking. In those instances, we defer towards existing intuitions for the reason that Valerie already explains. Great. Let us talk about the specific cases then. First of all, let's talk about the religious case. The first observation I want to make, which beats Prime Minister, is in the vast majority of cases, individuals who are the child alongside the parent perceive preferences and utility in a different way as the doctor, because as PM correctly identifies, doctor is not religious, doctor is not philosophy, doctor is not sociology. What that means is that doctor will use medical utility to conceptualize of decisions, but obviously for a religious person, that utility calculus shifts. And the harm is that in the vast majority of instances, the child often also conforms to the religious conception of the world. So they believe that their life is less meaningful now when they get that blood transfusion. And that is why we wanted to honor their particular preferences. The response we got from PM is, no, but it's about the future of the child. First response, if you're religious and you're like 14, you're probably going to be religious when you're 19. So it seems like we are honoring the future preferences of the child. But second and more importantly, and this is very important, increasingly with the rise of secularization and wokeism in society, there are increasingly more mechanisms for individual children to opt out of religious families. So if you really hate religion, for example, you often do have mechanisms to run away, to get other legal guardians, to get individuals to be able to protect you and be your proxy, because we have fundamental moral objections that are different. So the type of people who are children who come with their parents who are religious, in these particular instances, more often than not, have religious preferences, and that is why it was sufficient. No, thank you. But the final thing I would say here is, even if you don't buy that, it seems like a lot of the prop argument on why life is worth living defaults to utilitarianism. And we explain why the life is not worth living, because you get shunned by your village elders, you get shunned by everyone who is religious, so you fucking feel like shit because you do not have anything. All Cavan says in response to this is, no, because you can blame the doctors. No, because the religious guy will say, you could have stopped the doctors, you could have taken the child away, you could have done anything, but you didn't, so you all deserve to hell. And that is not only bad for the family itself, which is more utilitarian harm than just one individual who is dying, but also bad to the child who's going to get bullied for the rest of their lives. Yes, POI.
So no matter how much they desperately want to, we don't allow children to consent into having sex or getting married. Why would we let them consent into dying because they are afraid of pain or prioritize their hair?
Okay, dog, I mean, like, I think we already explained why maybe this is a particularly important decision that they're also going to decide they want to do in the future. But not respective of that, our argument on our analysis on parents explain why this is important. The last thing I would posit here is there's likely going to be massive amounts of resistance when you do something that is against the wish of the parents. We think this actually is the reason why you trade off against things like medical capital, because now when you're fighting more, the doctor has less time to seek other patients and talk to them. And that is when people who actually want and need help are likely going to die. That is another active impact for us to get ahead in the debate. The final thing I want to talk about is just for financial reasons. Their claim here is to say you consented into it. Well, obviously you did not consent. And let's be clear, like, it's not like you just want your child to die, right? You probably did everything you could to try to make your child stay alive, but realize that you couldn't. So you had GoFundMes, you had like programs, and you talked to your neighbors, you begged for money. But despite all of these circumstances, you realize that the only thing you can do in order to ensure that your family, your siblings, your other children live a happy life is to unfortunately let that child go. And we think in those instances, it is legitimate, both because A, if you don't do that, there is a massive harm to everyone else, including other children who's not gonna fucking die or live a horrible life. But second of all, even if the child gets like saved, they feel like dog shit and their life becomes substantially worse. For all those reasons, off.
Thanks for that speech, Govvik.
Hi, can I be seen and heard clearly?
Yep.
All right, POIs through chat. All my teammates did shout outs, so I'll do shout outs, but my debate kids don't watch live streams or on the Zoom. So I guess I'll shout out our incoming year one NUS junior Wayla.
Wayla!
Is he even here?
I
He
don't
should
know.
be here.
Please come to training on Tuesday and Wednesday. Thanks. Okay. We shouldn't let parents allow their child to die just because treatment is expensive, especially when doctors themselves recommend life, especially when alternatives are there to support the parents financially. Let's take a step back and assess this debate, because this debate assumes that a medical professional makes a recommendation for this life-saving treatment. What does this look like? Cavan and Ian already gave you structural reasons. Here's the highlight of their contributions that I think largely went unresponded, or at least like largely still stay even after the responses from side negative. What did we tell you? One, we told you that this happens normally after consensus with multiple doctors or multiple consultations by the nature of medical decision making. You need to interact with all parties during the treatment. It's the kids, it's the parents, and therefore you'll have the interest of the child, which is the client or the patient, in mind. This can look like terminal illnesses where there are standard operating procedures with how doctors normally approach things like cancer, or maybe referring to past procedures when you're in the face of a child who was hit by a car and you need to decide on blood transfusions, etc. What is the second thing we told you? We told you that these doctors have professional interests. They don't want to get sued for malpractice by forcing a child to live in suffering by recommending bad experimental treatment. This overrides the profit incentive we hear from opposition when they say, oh, doctors will be sponsored by Big Pharma. Big Pharma also doesn't want to get sued for medical malpractice, and this incentive therefore extends to that case as well. What is the conclusion of this? The first is very simple. Medical professionals make the best decisions because they operate based on standard operating procedures. They are well-trained, well-studied for the many reasons Ian and Cavan tells you. The second conclusion of this is that this means that the cases wherein this debate occurs are those where the child is unlikely to suffer long-term from the doctor's recommendation. The doctors aren't going to force parents to pay ridiculous amounts of money to barely even keep a child alive who can barely walk, who can barely breathe, at the expense of the other kids in the family. Doctors don't want to make recommendations where they can medically prove that the child will suffer in the long term and barely even be alive at all. So the way here is simple. Cavan tells you that doctors are more consistent actors that are easier to hold accountable. They can be sued. Their decisions can come into question because it's based on science and facts that can be called into account and can be reviewed even after by external parties. This is more consistent and more convincing than parents who have varied interests and lived experiences whose interests differ from individual to individual. So judges, what you will believe at the end of this is the more persuasive characterization, and that is of medical professionals being more reliable and more accountable actors as compared to parents who shouldn't be allowed to let their children die just because treatment is expensive or they're unable to find alternatives, which you already proved to you are likely to happen already. What is the case then you hear coming from our side of the house? There are two things I want to highlight in our path to victory. The first is that parents have no right to reject life-saving treatment in the instances that Ian tells you, which are the likely circumstances in which this debate occurs. He outlines to you 3 specific cases. What does side negative tell us? Side negative says, well, parents are close to their kid. The kid can tell their parents that they're okay with a certain decision, and then the parents make the decision on behalf of their kid. Even if a 12-year-old tells their parents that they want to drink, that they want to get married, underage drinking is still illegal. Child marriage is still illegal. Side negative does not prove why parents are allowed to make decisions on behalf of the child that comes with guaranteed harms. Guys, this is not about cutting your hair to save your life. This is about death, which is irreversible, and parents cannot make that decision to let the kid die just because the kid says they're okay with it, precisely because in this case, the child is a minor, they are vulnerable, and the logic of like the parent being able to consent does not extend in this instances. This is where I want to flag that opposition is pushing a false comparative on us. The alternative on affirmative isn't the kid being forced to make a decision under pressure in the hospital. We're not going to do that. The alternative is the kid doesn't make a decision at all because the doctor and the medical professional's recommendation is what we will resort to on our side of the house. What else did side negative tell us in this instance? Side negative tells us, well, treatment is expensive. Well, guys, you have things like public healthcare systems, you have medical debt, there are electoral incentives and political will where when in the instance where saving children is no longer optional, as Cavan and Ian already tell you. Again, these largely go unresponded to by side opposition. On our side, we even say future kids because we create a culture where we care about the life of children and having the political will to put a lot of money into supporting these kinds of instances. And I also want to be clear, a lot of these life-saving treatment aren't ridiculously expensive. They're things like blood transfusion when the kid just needs blood because they underwent like a car crash, for example. And that's also why when side negative says, well, this happens after you've exhausted all options already, it just doesn't work because you can't ask money from your neighbor or create a GoFundMe page in the 1 hour your child is at the emergency room when you have to let the doctor get them have a medical like a blood transfusion, right? So the likely cases in which this happened just doesn't make sense given the responses coming from side negative. This is why when they tell you that the rest of the family will suffer, the child will get blamed, it's just unreasonable and unlikely in terms of like level of likelihood in this debate. So for that reason, their characterization already loses. But again, let's be charitable. Even if this happens, there are 2 things I want to say here. Firstly, if the parents are likely to treat their child horribly, blame them, tell them that it's their fault for putting the family into poverty, then reasonably the state will likely intervene in these instances, especially when the kid's probably already on the watch list for having gone through some life-saving treatment. If the parents express to the doctor, we'd rather let the child die, but still are forced to refer to the doctor's like recommendation because they have no right on our side of the house, the doctor will probably be like, why would you want to let your kid die, and presumably reasonably report it to the state, or the state will intervene in this instance in the way the state already intervenes in many instances when the child is suspected to be abused or suspected to be treated in horrible ways in their own household. The second response I want to make here is that children can later choose to decide if they want to die when they are of legal age. If life is really that bad and they don't want to live in a wheelchair anymore, when they are already of legal age, they can choose to undergo euthanasia, for example. We think that because you are a child, you are unable to consent in this instance, and that is why parents cannot make that decision on behalf of their kids. That is the nuance in this debate. Before I move on to the second major contribution from affirmative point,
So it seems like your characterization of doctors keeps shifting as each speech on prop goes. In first prop, you said they're like super good at making medical decisions. Now you say they can take into account social circumstances and familial nuance. I just want to be clear so we can respond in op whip. What is the
no, I
characterization?
did not say that they can take note of social circumstances and nuance. What I'm saying is they are doctors who care about kids who are their client, who are their patients, who operate based on standard operating procedures. My brain is not capable of being smarter than Ian and Cavan. Everything I say is their material. Moving on then, what is the second major contribution you hear coming from our team? We tell you that defaulting to choosing life through life-saving treatment is the only moral choice. Again, this is the most proximate benefit in this debate. Ian tells you the state has an obligation to the future person of this child as a future free agent, because right now, this child cannot consent. Children cannot choose to go euthanasia or undergo marriage when they are 10 years old. And note that right now, this child needs to be protected because they are vulnerable and they're unable to consent. This overrides religious freedom. This overrides maybe living a potentially poorer life, because the prerequisite to accessing any of these other rights or living your life to the fullest is for you to be alive. So life in this debate is the most proximate obligation that the state has. So all of the things opposition argues are speculative. What we can do as a state is to not give the parents this option, because you have to defend the right to life. This is why doctors maximizing the ability to live is good in the context of this debate. It's great that they want to preserve the life of this child, because all other rights stem from this one instance of letting the child live. For these reasons, we are very proud to affirm.
Thanks for that speech, Opvip.
Can everyone see and hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things. Firstly, who is this debate actually about? Secondly, the life of the child itself. Thirdly, on impacts on other individuals. Firstly, then on who this debate is about. The first thing I want to posit is whether or not you actually get the extensive talks and group of doctors helping you that proposition keeps asserting they have. I posit that this is probably very unlikely. The first is that the healthcare system is just significantly underfunded. Proposition cannot come up here and say there's so much public funding. I think it's quite elitist to say that. Even in countries like the US, for example, healthcare is extremely inaccessible, especially in developing nations or other areas. So the likely scenario is that you're not going to have a group of doctors that are consulting you, and you get 20 minutes of attention by the doctor at best. But secondly, even if it's about things like life, even if they have huge amounts of money, the fact that it's oftentimes a life-saving procedure probably implies that there's huge urgency. They still do not respond. What happens when a child, for example, gets hit by a car? You obviously do not have the time to understand all of these circumstances in which the family is going through, the concerns of the child, the opinions of the child, whether or not the child is doing well, and whether they want to live, whether they have other diseases, for example. So the conclusion of all of this is that 80% of the instances that proposition wants to talk about, the doctor has minimal information to understand what is the correct choice to make. But let's be charitable. Let's say you do have unlimited time and you have unlimited doctors to consult. The problem and the reasons as the unique reasons of weighing as to why the doctor is unlikely to still make the correct decision is a couple of fold. The first is that you just obviously are very risk averse, right? If it is true that, life is very irreversible, as proposition wants to talk about, people would get really, really pissed if you kill the life of a child, then obviously you don't want to get sued and you therefore always choose to preserve life. But secondly, there's huge uncertainty in terms of you getting your license taken away. The first reason as to why this is true is just because there's a high bar in terms of your license getting taken away in the very first place, right? Because doctors are the ones who make the standards of whether or not your license is taken away. Obviously, they're going to create a very high themselves, but also because understand that there's always huge risks to healthcare, etc. So put the bar high in order to not not let a bunch of doctors lose their jobs. The child or the parent, they dictate how your information is presented. So long as they want to make profit, for example, they don't want to get sued, they can present your information in a way that says, hey, this life treatment was actually something that was plausible and something that I should have done, and therefore still opt for life-saving treatments. So the conclusion of all of this is that it's very uncertain whether or not you actually get your license taken away, verbal PI. So
Fine.
versus on Arts of House, the profit, for example, is something that is very certain, and obviously doctors will opt into that. But thirdly, your vision is clouded by a bunch of protocol. So if it's true, as Cavan says, that as Cavan spends 3 minutes proving, you learn a bunch through school and you follow things the doctor protocol, blah, blah, blah. The problem with this is, and as Ted also explains, is that you only use medical utility. So you do not take into account, for example, the life of the family and whether or not the child wants to live, because all you care about is medical protocol that you learned for 7 years in school. So the more they stress how you have clear standards and accountability, the worse their impact becomes, because we prove to us why those standards are inapplicable to each individual, and that leads to perverse outcomes. Second thing I'm going to prove within this then is what the likely incentives of the parents are. I think it's likely that they understand the situation, their familial situation, and the child's belief, etc., etc. Would they rather live a life in a wheelchair, or whether or not they actually just want to die instead? Therefore, I'm going to prove to you as to why they're likely to act in a representative way that is the utility of the child. The reason is that yes, if they choose to have the child in the very first place, this proposition wants to talk about, obviously you love them a lot because you didn't choose to abort them, for example, when you realized that you had a child, or when they had Down syndrome, etc. But secondly, even if parents are super, super abusive, you just don't bring them to the hospital in the very first place on proposition side of the house, right? If you really hate your child that much, you don't bring them to the hospital because you're gonna have to make that, you're going to be forced to let them live on proposition. So the fact that you bring them to the hospital in the very first place probably signifies that you want them to live to some extent. So thirdly, if it's truly as irreversible as proposition wants to talk about, then probably your child live. Therefore, the conclusion of all this is that this debate is about children who have very little chance to live or have like no money for the treatment, but are forced into these medical like surgeries or what forcing them into it because they do not have a choice. Before I move on, go.
The endpoint of our material about doctors is not that doctors will decide well, but that doctors are risk-averse and will defer to parents on children in cases where there might be suffering. Rather, this debate is about clear-cut cases like blood transfusion, where there's little risk, but parents are imposing their religious values onto their poor children.
Okay, but even if that is the case, I'm going to prove later and I'll talk to you why that harm is worse on your side. Second thing then on the life of the child. I just posit that the child lives a terrible and miserable life. And it's because of a couple of reasons. The first scenario is even if they live, the first harm is that they have huge side effects. Even like a lot of individuals, for example, as children, they go through chemotherapy 3, 4, 5 times. That's really, really sad for them. They have heart transplants and they die like 3 years later. Obviously, this is not a life you ought to have children live, and they do not want to live in that way. But you force them to do so on proposition because you take away their choice. But secondly, and this responds to your POI on religious harms, you force children to incur huge amounts of ostracization. You force them to think that they're going to go to hell for the rest of their lives, right? And the likely scenario on proposition side is when parents realize this and they do not want to go against their religion, they take away the choice of the treatment away from the child in and of itself because they choose to not go to hospital because they know that you're going to force them to do blood transfusions, etc. So you decrease the availability of healthcare to people who are religious. But in the second scenario in which like the parents wants you to die, as Cavan says, this is very extreme. The benefit of you allowing your child to die is that they no longer have to live under the abuse and the ostracization of the parent. So if you force the parent who really wants their child to die to continue to like allow the child to live, you just harm the child in the long term. Lastly, then on the idea of family, I would just want to prove why healthcare is quite expensive and it's quite elitist that they say public funding is very helpful. The first is just it's empirically true, right? In a lot of countries, healthcare is super expensive. Look at like Canada, US, etc., etc. But secondly, oftentimes even if the state funds you, life-saving treatments are privately funded by individuals because they're very expensive, and the state understands that they don't have the money to fund these things. So therefore, the conclusion of this is that oftentimes the choice on whether or not you want to fund your child and like get treatment only exists for the richest of the rich or rich people in rich countries. So the delta here is that a lot of people in developing nations or the poorest of the poor do not get this choice, but are forced into that choice. The harms of this were a couple of fold. The first is just that you harm the child itself, because if they have to do treatments in the future, they can't afford it. But secondly, you harm more individuals, such as their family members, such as their siblings. The reason as to why this is winning is because one, these siblings did not consent to like suffering either. But secondly, it's on scale. You harm 4 siblings instead of 1 person. Because of all these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech of reply.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Oh, I hurt my elbow on the chair. Okay, it's okay. I'm fine now. Thank you for asking. Cool. The problem with this affirmative team is that they kept shifting the incentive of doctors when it suited them and was convenient. In first proposition, they said that doctors are very medical people who cared about very medical things and don't know much about sociology or have feelings about the nuances of their patients. By third prop, they said, actually, doctors care about doctor things, but alongside that, they also care about things, for example, like the way in which parental relationship and context might come into effect. The issue of that is either it is the case that, to an extent, doctors deferred in certain instances to the sentiments of parents and children who are their clients, at which point they massively minimize the ability for them to get ahead in this debate, or it is the case that you buy our characterization, which is a lot more consistent and compelling, which is obviously doctors are not assholes, but they defer towards caring about making sure the medical procedure is carried out because they err on the side of caution. Because if they decided not to do a procedure and the child dies, it is always probable and likely that the parent end up being irrational and blaming the doctor. So the way to create ass coverage as a response to that is to always carry out the procedure. No, this does not mean they're going to fucking amputate the limbs of the child. They're still going to do safe procedures. But the harm we had done was, first of all, it means that you systematically ignored the sentiments of both parents and the child. But second, and more importantly, this mattered in the debate because even if a medical procedure is safe or a medical procedure is not bad, there's still harms that exist that only the child can experience for the rest of their lives. Like whether or not their heart throbs every single time they stand up, whether or not they don't have the ability to do specific things. And we explain why. If it is the case that they say child has the ability to make decision after 18, reasonably they can extrapolate their preferences based on what they are now because those conditions do not fucking change. If that was true, the simple question in this debate is, how do you best preserve and make life enjoyable? Because notice the principle that affirmative want to run boils down into making sure people can stay alive and making sure the child's rights are not violated. We expanded this debate on negative because we said, yes, that was important to an extent, but also bear in mind, doctors oftentimes make sure the child cannot do that. But beyond this, that then probably suggests that this debate ought to be about third-party harms as well, because their justification for why we ought to care about the life of the child is because people deserve to live. That suggests that if we can prove that this policy on proposition makes it harder for people to live good lives, then we also win on their own metric. What did we explain under this? The first thing we suggested was that in the religious cases that Ian wants to talk about, there is an active harm, which is to say that the child gets shamed, the family gets shamed, and on Wing, this is far more prevalent because number one, often in religious communities, as we explained, you have no other alternative for social networks. So if that was the case and you no longer have sex pseudos, then you live a horrible life that is almost equidistant to dying because no one cares about you, no one talks to you, you face massive amounts of shunning and suffering. But beyond that, the child then feels bad as a result of that. And I don't think the DPM response, which is, well, no, there can be like nuance and understanding that it wasn't your fault, works for the reason that they're going to blame you anyways. So that was an independent reason why by their own metric of third-party harm, of preserving life and making sure people live good lives, we are ahead. But the second thing we explained was just to say, well, actually, there are also instances in which parents, realize that unfortunately, the trade-off when you do this procedure is that your siblings, for example, die because you don't have the economic capacity to do so. And the two responses from Government here, I think, is the reason why they have to lose the debate. Because the first set of responses, well, it's an snap decision, which means you don't have the ability to acquiesce things, for example, like GoFundMe and all of these funds. If that is true, then obviously parents love their child. They'll try to make sure the child stays alive. The only instance in which they have to ruthlessly say no is they realize that the immediate upfront cost of that medical procedure means that they can't do anything else because that is the entirety of their life savings. And as a result of that, they need to mortgage their house, their siblings, all of the other individuals who also deserve the right to life now dies or is forced to live in a very perilous condition. In those instances, we said on our side, we are okay with that trade-off because more individuals are able to stay alive. Or the second scenario GovWeb gives, which is you have time to acquiesce funding, etc. What that probably suggests is that you will do this procedure unless you realize that the funding they give you is insufficient, at which point the same wing then kicks in. The final thing I want to explain here is the macro capacity, which is even if you don't buy any of this, we explain a bunch of auxiliary harms. Number one, you decrease the capacity to help other individuals who want to and are in need of help because there's a huge trade-off. But second of all, you waste medical resources because if you save them and then after they're 18, they kill themselves, that is obviously undesirable. You much rather those money and resources go elsewhere. That is why we win the debate on propositions or metric.
Thanks for that speech. Gov reply to conclude.
What is it?
Sorry, you turned off my laptop.
Oh.
Okay, it's on now.
Why am I not moving?
Hold up.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Panel, the first thing you might be confused about is the scope of this debate. This opposition team claims that it is about painful procedures that have a low likelihood of success. This is the least likely scenario. Those treatments are experimental, they're unlikely to have received clearance and approval, and therefore are unlikely to be recommended by the vast majority of doctors that want to preserve their license. We explained that this is about life-saving treatments that have a significant chance of working that have minimal hurt to the patient. These are tried and tested treatments. There have been research done about it. This is not about the cases of very rare diseases that require incredibly invasive and experimental treatment. This looks like blood transfusions during an accident, which is the most common life-saving treatment. So if you are confused about whether this debate is about experimental treatments that have a low likelihood of success or about blood transfusions, let me break this deadlock for you. The first thing is rare diseases and experimental treatments are the vast minority, the statistical minority of cases for why individuals go to the hospital. So on net, more children enter the hospital because they need blood transfusion. So in the majority of cases where people enter the hospital, our case is more relevant. But also, their intuition that it might be painful to go through a treatment just doesn't pass the intuition test. Because we often break the ribs of people when we want to do CPR. We don't think to ourselves, maybe it'll be really painful when we hurt their ribs. Maybe I wouldn't revive them, because we know that the consequences of dying is way more severe than the pain of having a broken rib. The first question I want to ask, therefore, is whether parents have the right to choose. This claim is the most upstream in the debate. No matter what opposition says about mortgaging your house or the child wanting to die or the treatment being painful, all of this is analytically behind us because we prove that parents are never allowed to do things that objectively harm the child, which in this case is death. Parental rights never extend that far. So even if the life is worse off afterwards, they do not prove that parents have the right to say, your life afterwards is worse, I will allow you to die now. The second question is whether death is an objective harm. Their claim here is that people might prioritize their religious belief or they might not want pain. Here's a thought experiment. If you see someone unconscious but they're wearing like a rosary on your neck, will you think to yourself, maybe I shouldn't give them CPR because they might not want a premarital kiss and then they'll be ostracized from their church afterwards? You wouldn't think that. You would just save the lives of that person because your religious identity exists downstream from your identity as a human being that is alive and experiencing the world. So religious beliefs always come afterwards. The first thing we do is keep people alive. We don't let people die just because of certain religious belief. And I just want to point out here that a lot of their arguments about what if you're ostracized from the religion, what if you have this existential fear that God hates you because you took a blood transfusion, is guesswork, right? They are guessing that the child will be ostracized from church. The parent in that moment is feeling paranoia. The parent in that moment is not thinking rationally. They are guessing that maybe the church will ostracize them, and based on that guesswork, that hypothetical that maybe in the next 10 years my child's life will be worse, they are saying the child ought to die. They are making an irreversible decision in the moment that the child should not exist anymore on this planet for the possibility that the child might live a worse life over like in 10 years. The fundamental thing is nobody here is clairvoyant. We don't know whether the child's next 10 years of their life will be worse. Maybe the next 1 year is bad and the church ostracizes them, but maybe afterwards they find another community and their life is amazing. They never get a chance to get those experiences because the parent decides prematurely the child ought to die. Our worst case scenario is the child gets kicked out of church or family struggles financially, but even poor people and even people who are not religious and even people who are ostracized from the church can lead meaningful lives and have good experiences. Their worst case scenario is a child never grows up to be an adult. They never get to see what they look like when they're in their 30s. They never get to experience romantic love. They never get to travel the world. Their life ended before it started. That is the greatest tragedy in this debate that their side allows to happen because maybe the child might not want to be in a wheelchair. The next question is whether doctors are qualified to choose. We beat this claim on weighing because we explained there's accountability and standardization. But I just want to point out, doctors think about it from a medical and objective perspective. All of their interests flow from the child being alive. Religious beliefs are contingent on people being alive and worshipping God. That is why preserving life is always the most default choice and always a good choice. And that is why the opposition case does not pass the threshold of believability. You're going to have to believe that doctors recommend experimental and painful treatments, and you're going to have to believe that the child's life is objectively worse on for eternity for you to give this opposition team the win.
Thanks for that speech and speakers for a wonderful final. I think the recording can stop now.